I might just very quickly, some people here, of course, will know this, and I'm sorry to bore you, but I might just explain how I became involved with autism. Because it was very interesting that Peter said to me, who I was sitting next to, how he noticed most people who work in the field of autism have a personal connection. They have a relative, a child, or a brother or sister. I don't think that's necessarily true. And it's interesting that that is the perception. And I think it may be because autism, up until relatively recently, was considered to be a very rare condition, which of course now we know perfectly well it is by no means rare, that I think people assumed you must have a personal reason for getting involved in it. And I don't think it's true. I think there are many, many people, and many of them in this room, who care about autism without having a personal reason. Although having said that, the more we discover about the spectrum and just how broad it is, I think most of us do have a personal reason. We actually do have a relative somewhere on the spectrum, but that's another issue. I went to a tea party at the House of Commons many, many years ago, I think over 30 years ago, and it was celebrating various children's charities. And I was there accepting a cheque on behalf of Save the Children. And they'd invited children from the different charities to tea. And I was sitting looking at another table of children and couldn't quite work out why they were there or what disability they were representing. Obviously, you'll guess the end of this story. And they were just behaving slightly differently than the way you would expect children to behave at a party, but I couldn't quite see what it was. So I went over and got chatting to the carer that was with them, looking after them. And this woman explained to me that they were autistic, as we would have called it then. I'd vaguely heard of it. I think I was probably fairly typical of people at that time. I'd vaguely heard of it, had no idea what it really was. And she took a lot of trouble to explain this very complex condition. I later discovered that this woman was Lorna Wing. So many of you here will understand that my very first experience of hearing anything about autism was from perhaps the greatest figure in the world of autism that we've ever known, who, of course, first identified the triad of impairments and identified the fact it was a spectrum and so on. So I was immediately intrigued. And when I was asked later on to open a playgroup, I think for the National Autistic Society, I jumped at it. And the more I became involved, the more interested I was. As many of you will know, once you dip into the world of autism, you tend to stay there. Because not only, of course, is it potentially a devastating and extremely distressing condition, but it's also very fascinating and makes you think about what we mean to be normal and human, and the way that we interact with each other, and just how very peculiar we so-called neurotypicals are. And I very much subscribe now to the view that we are by no means normal, clearly, and we're only neurotypicals because there are more of us, and we are more typical. And somebody with Asperger's, or indeed more severe autism, has just as valid a way, if not more valid in many ways, of looking at the world. So that's how I came to be involved, and I'm honoured and delighted to be in positions with various organisations that do such wonderful work. Talking of which, I was very glad to hear John talk about meeting Mark Lever later on, and indeed that hopefully the NAS can join with the Alliance in some way or other. It's awful to think of organisations working in such an important area to be in any way prickly with each other, or not speaking to each other, or resentful of each other. We talk about knockabout politics. Knockabout voluntary sector is just agony, because we all have to work towards the greater good. And as long as it's helping people with autism, I don't care if I'm working with Research Autism or Autistica or the Alliance or the National Autistic Society. As long as it gets to those who need it, that's fine. So part your elbow, John, and anything I can do to build bridges, of course, I would be delighted. But of course, the purpose of today is to hopefully continue the spread of awareness. Yes, we've come such a long way, but yes, of course, there is a very, very long way to go. The kind of awareness that I would love to see move forward, and forgive me, I spoke about this a bit yesterday, but really important that every teacher just has a little bit of knowledge about autism. Still teachers come to us and say, I just don't understand it, I don't know how to cope, I didn't spot that child in my class because I didn't know about it. And it's not difficult. Half a day, maybe a day training in autism, which is really relatively simple to do, not only will help that teacher to identify that child that they will come across in their class that is on the spectrum, but I believe will help them to deal with all children, because once you have that awareness of how somebody's mind works, who may be a little different than ours, it helps you, I think, to understand all minds, or to be aware of how you are communicating. And talking about employment, Norman, which of course I'm desperately keen on, you know, that everybody's losing out on both sides. It's just as helpful to the employers when they have a little bit of training in autism, or they employ somebody with autism. Look at the brilliant Jonathan over there who works at Goldman Sachs. It benefits all those who work with them, I think, to have that sort of clarity of thought, to say what you mean, you know, not to be blurry, not to use too many idioms and corporate speak and so on, but to be clear and straightforward. It benefits everybody. So if teachers, as you say, doctors, policemen, terribly important. I remember one of the Jackson family, you may well have heard of them. There was some television programs about this family with 3 boys with autism. And Luke, the youngest one, a very bright young man, but on the spectrum. And I remember he was talking to a policeman, I think, who was sort of held him up because Luke was behaving rather oddly. And the policeman said something like, "Oh, come on, you know, pull your socks up." And Luke bent down and pulled up his socks. And of course, immediately the policeman thought he was, you know, being made fun of, and Luke was in more trouble and so on. You know, silly little things like that can just make such a difference if the police can be aware of some of the difficulties of those on the spectrum. And even doctors. You know, we still find doctors don't know enough about autism, which is, I would have thought, relatively easy to change. And yes, it can't be left to ministers and those in Whitehall, but we need them. You know, like it or not, there is a huge financial problem. The cuts in local authority budgets are affecting drastically, of course, as they are so many people with so many problems, affecting those with autism. And as you say, families who have to go to tribunal, you know, and all that, and then even when they go to tribunal, that may not be fulfilled, and that is a real problem. The research project you were talking about yesterday, which Steve's wonderful foundation is paying for, is a financial research. Very, very interesting and important. I would love to prove that the money, you know, that you put in early on saves so much in the long term. I know it's always a problem because it will be another government that possibly reaps the benefit. So it's very, very difficult. But I think this piece of research is going to be really interesting to see the financial gains from doing what we should be doing. Of course, we're talking about people, but like it or not, the world runs on money, and we have to prove that it's worthwhile in every way. So that's really all I have to say. I'm honoured to be a champion in this wonderful initiative. Autism-friendly, yes, but very complex, like the condition. An autism-friendly cinema to one child, you know, where it's all noisy, you can make a silly noise, shout and scream and throw things. But to some children with autism, that is anathema. So to them, autism-friendly would be silent, quiet, dark. So it's complicated, but we need to try and, you know, work for everybody. But thank you very much for inviting me. Let's hope we gain a lot from this lovely lunch. And thank you, Norman, for coming. Thanks.